Welcome everyone to our spring webinar series, The Long Civil Rights Movement. I'm Dave Johnson, currently serving as past president of MCSS as well as the Online Learning Committee chair. I'm very excited for tonight's programming. Tonight is part one of a four-part series. If you've registered for this one, you should consider heading to the MCSS website and registering for parts 2, 3, and 4 as well. As many of you know, events stemming from the summer of 2020, most particularly the murder of George Floyd, resulted in one of the first organizational statements that the Michigan Council for the Social Studies has put out in many, many years. We promise to use our collaborative voice to make positive changes in education and our local communities, and tonight's discussion is just one more step down this pathway. For the first three sessions of this series, we'll be guided by Dr. Michael Butler from Flagler College in Florida. I'll introduce him in just a moment, but first, a few quick housekeeping things. There is a lot going on in this slide, but there's a lot going on in general with MCSS. The Michigan Council for the Social Studies is a nonprofit organization staffed entirely by volunteers. Our tagline, not a mission or a vision, but rather a snapshot of what we believe, is that tomorrow's leaders are learning today, and the teachers across this great state are the ones preparing them for the future. Whether a current member or not, we hope you'll consider joining or renewing your membership with us as we seek to partner with and support you in this important endeavor. For $40 a year, MCSS members gain access to special webinar series recaps like this one. You receive the MCSS Toolbox, a publication just for members that contains tips and strategies for teaching social studies. We run an annual Olympiad for students, which is an amazing opportunity to showcase the great things your students are doing in your classroom. You'll receive 2 issues of the Great Lakes Social Studies Journal each year. This new peer-reviewed journal contains articles on both theory and practice. You'll receive a discounted rate to our annual conference, currently slated to be back in person again next year in beautiful Traverse City, Michigan. You'll be able to be a part of additional training opportunities like the one we just wrapped up with the Library of Congress on teaching with primary sources. And finally, your membership provides advocacy. Pictured here is former President Annie Whitlock at the Capitol meeting with legislators about the important work you do in the classroom. MCSS is a thriving organization, and we hope you'll consider joining or renewing today. This recap is partially filmed live and partially filmed after the fact. I forgot to hit record until about 10 minutes into this session. So with the biography for Dr. Butler, you'll have a very abrupt transition into the beginning of the presentation, and then the rest will flow as normal. Dr. J. Michael Butler is a Keenan Distinguished Professor of History at Flagler College, where he has taught since 2008. His work has appeared in many leading peer-reviewed academic publications, such as the Journal of American Studies, the Journal of Southern History, the Florida Historical Quarterly, and Southern Cultures. His book, Beyond Integration, The Black Freedom Struggle in Escambia County, Florida, 1960 through 1980, won a 2017 Florida Book Award in nonfiction. Dr. Butler specializes in Southern cultural history with an emphasis on the civil rights movement. He teaches a number of classes on the topic and has served as the lead scholar in multiple teacher training seminars related to the civil rights movement. His current project is an examination of Black popular culture, cultural production between 1965 and 1980. And with that, I turn it over to Dr. Butler.
One of the concepts that historians use to describe the civil rights movement is the idea of a long civil rights movement. Now, what this means is that the movement does not end in 1968 or any other monumental or important event. It continues through the contemporary. But we also push the timeline back farther than where the traditional movement typically starts, which is 1954 or 1955. The long civil rights movement then provides students with the idea that, as the freedom struggle song emphasizes, freedom is a constant struggle. As long as there has been oppression, as long as there has been injustice, there has been resistance to that injustice. So the long civil rights movement expands the way we think about the civil rights movement. With that being said, though, we still need bookends for our students. We still need some sort of chronology. Otherwise, we start the civil rights movement when the first Africans arrive in British North America in Jamestown in 1619, right? So I think for the purposes of the long civil rights movement, the best place to start is with what the traditional movement tried to first reverse, and that is legalized segregation. So if we have to start somewhere with our emphasis on the long civil rights movement, that it makes sense that it would begin with the passage of what historians have long called one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in American history, Plessy versus Ferguson. 1896. Reconstruction has been over for almost 20 years. Southern states are writing laws that officially separate whites and blacks in places of public accommodation. It was about the restoration of the quote unquote racial order, the organic society that white Southerners prized, that Reconstruction messed up entirely. So as a part of establishing place and order, there comes a hierarchy of racial domination that state laws codify. Now that's a fancy way of saying states pass segregation laws to keep places of public accommodation separate for African American and white citizens. Now, the first place where we see segregation laws really being passed is in the realm of transportation, because that's where whites and blacks in the South are in the most consistent contact. Trains, streetcars, cabs, whatever the case may be. These laws provided for a white area, whether it is a waiting room, a ticket window, or an actual streetcar, and a separate quote unquote colored or Negro car. Homer Plessy was an octoroon from Louisiana, and an octoroon was actually the official classification of an individual as 1/8 black, which that kind of goes to show you that the racial classification based on the number of parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents you had that were considered black demonstrates that there is a rage for classifying racial status in the post-Civil War South. Regardless, Homer Plessy had always considered himself white. He was forced to enter a blacks-only streetcar. The streetcar was inferior in accommodations. It was dilapidated. Windows were broken. Long story short, Plessy's insulted, sues the owner of the streetcar company, and the case makes it all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Plessy versus Ferguson. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in a 7-1 verdict that separate but equal accommodations were constitutional. A primary source that would be wonderful for students to use, particularly at the high school levels, is the dissenting opinion of Judge Harlan. Judge Harlan, because of his vociferous critique of the majority opinion, became known as the Great Dissenter. And it's in this response where he said the Constitution of the United States must remain colorblind. Yet the die was cast, and segregation became legalized in all shapes and forms throughout the South. It is not an oversimplification to say that if it could be segregated, because it was considered a public accommodation in the South, it was. We have the famous or infamous photograph from the Library of Congress that appears in so many of our US history textbooks in the Jim Crow section, right? With the young black man drinking from a water jug labeled colored. We have white, colored, women, men, colored men here, right? This is a visual representation of what segregation looked like. But again, it doesn't really give you the depth to which segregation reached. If it could be segregated, it was. And of course, we look at institutions like schools. Schools were already segregated by default. Okay. Prisons, libraries, parks, beaches, swimming pools, cemeteries, segregated by law, even in death. There are instances in places where people are disinterred, Black as well as white, because they could not fathom the idea of visiting a loved one's grave and encountering someone of a different race. Hospitals are segregated by, well, depending on the city size, room, floor, separate building. Blood was actually stored based on type and race. And those types were not to cross racial boundaries. In Alabama, a law provided for the Jim Crow Bible, meaning that by law, every courthouse in the state had to have a white Bible for white people to swear in on before they testified in court, and a Black Bible for African Americans to swear in before they testified in court. Mississippi passed a law that prevented Blacks and whites from playing checkers. In Florida, my home state, it's one of only 2 states where a law is passed which stipulated that textbooks that children used in their segregated schools had to be stored in separate warehouses over the summer months. So even the books could not be stored together when classes weren't in session. That's the degree to which Jim Crow reached. And I'm just right now talking about laws. Jim Crow is a mindset. It is a way of life. And it's a way of life that emphasized white supremacy, because that's the purpose of segregation. Another great lesson for your students is to ask them, what is the purpose of segregation? What is the purpose? Why are there laws that mandate racial separation in places of public accommodation? And, I use this exercise in my college classes. And sometimes students just don't get the fact that it has nothing to do with the accommodation itself. It has to do with power. It has to do with control. It has to do with the establishment of laws by one group declaring this space to be superior because it's the space we occupy. So by default, it makes it superior. And the powerlessness of the marginalized, the minorities, to challenge those laws. The purpose of Jim Crow is to legally confer second-class citizenship status on an entire group of people due to a condition that they had no control in determining: the color of their skin. Violence often ensues when these boundaries are challenged. Sometimes, most of the times, I would argue, even unintentionally. Because you see, not only do we have laws that separate, but we have mindsets that dictate what is proper racial etiquette. You don't need laws written to stipulate that a Black person never looks a white person in the eye when addressing, that they must always remove their hat in the presence of a white person, that they always step off the sidewalk when a white person passes. That's the etiquette that's expected, the deference that's expected, which is a consequence of the mindset of a set of laws like Plessy. So in many instances, we have episodes of violence that escalate because one of these unwritten rules of racial etiquette has been broken. And when those unwritten etiquette rules are broken, it can often lead us to episodes of extreme, uncomfortable racial violence, which we have neglected in this country for far too long. So what happens when there's conflict during this period? And this opens a topic that remains both highly controversial, very uncomfortable, but also very necessary. And that is the period of lynching. It's really hard for me to introduce the topic and how it should be taught to a group of fellow educators because I don't know what the circumstances are. I don't know what grades you teach. I don't know what specific classes you might teach. But one of the things that we have to let our students know is that legal violence, legally sanctioned violence against minority groups in this country is something that marks our history. And it's not because I say so or other historians say so, it's because these were documented. What you're looking at right now is just the piece of a postcard. The lynching of African Americans was seen as a social event. It was ritualistic, it was brutal, and unfortunately, it was all too common. The high point of lynching in the United States coincided with the passage of Jim Crow laws in the South. Context here again is really important, and I know that's something that you preach to your students or teach. Preach, teach, same thing sometimes, right? Between 1890 and 1920 is the high point of lynching in the United States. It was so prevalent that Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens himself, called his country the United States of Lyncherdom. These weren't events and activities that communities tried to hide. In fact, one of the words that I may have just used that you found surprising is the fact that these are postcards. At this time, it was in the late 1880s that the Kodak Corporation manufactured a film for tourists so that when they traveled, took their own pictures with their 80-pound camera, you had to be really wealthy to have one, that the photos would print with an image on one side and an address label on the other so that you could send your own postcards. Well, one of the things that Southern communities began to do is to document these events, manufacture dozens of postcards so that people could send these through the mail to each other. On one side, they may have the name of the victim, the alleged crime, the date. But one of the things that's so powerful about a photograph is that you get to see the faces of the people who are there for entertainment purposes, okay? Who are there as a community event. And one of the things that I challenge my students to do when we examine these lynching postcards, and this is mild compared to some of the ones you'll see, okay? They're easy to find online, is to look at the faces of the people who are in the crowd. And what they tell you is that these people are well dressed. It means that they were going to an event, which means that they knew about what it was they were going to see. They're posing. Many are smiling. To get close to the corpse was seen as a place of prestige. So oftentimes you would see civic leaders, judges, sheriffs, ministers posing. The other thing, to bring this out of the realm of the macabre, is to talk about how common these events were. Roughly between 1890 and 1920 is the high point of lynching in the United States. The difficulty is knowing exactly how many lynchings have occurred in America during that time, because our understanding of what a lynching was has evolved over time as well, right? But what we can say is that during this period, 1890 to 1920, there were approximately 3,000 documented lynchings, 90% of which occurred in the former Confederacy. This is open war on African Americans who got out of their so-called place, period. It's meant to restore order. A lynching says more about the community that conducts the lynching than it does about the individual who's targeted. Now, and that's the other thing too about lynching. It is the targeting of an alleged, the targeting of a person for an alleged crime by the community outside of the formal judicial legal process, right? So that's the thing about these lynchings that bothered people like Mark Twain, is that this is anti-American. This is occurring outside of the legal justice system. Communities act as judge, jury, executioner, and they don't just kill the person that's targeted, but there is a ritualized, almost sadism that often came with it that newspapers documented. So we know that this happened. We don't know how many of them did, because all historians can do is go by the documented evidence, the primary sources, and the primary sources tell us that at the height of lynching, somewhere in the South, every 3 days, a person was lynched. At its high point, somewhere in the South, a person was lynched every 3 days. This establishes the social control that communities had over racial minorities, period. At the same time, again, to give us context, to get into what the civil rights movement is going to rally against, throughout the South, at this time, at the time that Jim Crow and the time that lynching is permeating the region, and oh, by the way, the rest of the nation is endorsing, is the dedication of Confederate monuments throughout the region. Now, again, we're having a lot of discussions as a nation about what the legacy of lynching is and what the legacy of the Confederate monuments are. And we really can't have those discussions unless we understand the history, right? So this history is relevant. It matters. The Confederate monument movement, that's a mouthful, was a symbol of what scholars call the lost cause. And it's basically the way that the white South rewrote the meaning of the Civil War, right? The lost cause was the way the South rewrote the meaning of the Civil War. It is a cultural rewriting of the past. One of my close advisors at the University of Mississippi wrote one of the first major books on the lost cause, and he called it a civil religion. And it's a civil religion because white Southerners made a cult of their past, and it's a manufactured past. Now, the thing about the lost cause is that it rewrites the reasons that the Civil War were fought and what the meaning of the Civil War was. So it wasn't treasonous, no. And it wasn't about the preservation of slavery. Oh, absolutely not, even though the secession ordinances are clear in saying what it was about, right? No, this was about states' rights. This was about the defense of original constitutional principles. This was about a struggle against Northern aggression, states' rights, federal intrusion. I always ask a state's right to do what, but that's neither here nor there. One of the things that occurred throughout the South is a literal craze in building monuments dedicated to preserving the memory and the literal mission of the Confederacy. What you're seeing right now is the dedication in 1907 of the Jefferson Davis Monument in New Orleans. And the Jefferson Davis Monument, oftentimes, well, sometimes, at least early on, and again, there is a history behind the Confederate monument building craze that's really fascinating to me, right? Because I grew up seeing these monuments everywhere. The earliest ones are dedicated to certain individuals. But as years passed, really between the 19-teens and the 1920s, they're dedicated to the common everyday Confederate soldier. So they're not Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis. So we know that in 1907, this is Jefferson Davis. This is in a really, really busy part of town because that's where they were intended to be built. Again, showing that the Confederate spirit is alive and well. And the Confederate spirit in 1907, during the rise of Jim Crow and the high point of lynchings, all of this is related, right? It is letting people know who is in charge of these communities politically, economically, and socially. So we have the Confederate banner that's covering the statue before the unveiling. You have thousands of people there. It's one of the largest post-Civil War gatherings of citizens in New Orleans through the Second World War. School children sit in a grandstand and they form a Confederate flag. They sing Dixie. It is a community event. What happens in New Orleans is a microcosm of what happens in communities throughout the South. We know that between 1900 and 1912, approximately 3/5 of all the Confederate monuments that were built in the United States between 1900 and 1912, approximately 3/5 of the monuments dedicated to the Confederacy are built somewhere in the South, somewhere in America, actually, because some are in the border states and some are even outside. So it is a physical reminder that the mentality of the Old South still existed. But remember one of the things that I said early when we introduced the topic. As long as there has been oppression, as long as there's been injustice, there's been resistance to injustice, right? And one of the things that we see nationally as a reaction to what's going on in the South is the greatest internal migration in world history. The Great Migration. Oops, don't need to jump ahead of myself there, right? The Great Migration. From 1900 to 1940, roughly speaking, and this is one of the questions I often get from my students anytime we have an exam, and of course it's written, it's not multiple choice or fill in the blank. I always say that you have to have 3 things that you address on all of your essays or all of your short answers to get full credit, and that's date, definition, and importance, right? So when it comes to date, and we have a topic like the Great Migration, students often get confused and are like, Dr. Butler, when did the Great Migration happen? I'm like, well, that's a loaded question. It's hard to give a beginning and end for something like the Great Migration, but there are periods in which you can make sense of this greater movement. And I think between 1900 and 1940 is the period in which most historians kind of emphasize that this is where the Great Migration peaks. Now, the Great Migration, as I said, is the largest internal migration in world history. A migration movement in which people who live within a nation's borders permanently relocate to another area of that nation, okay? Look, between 1917 and 1930 alone, between 1917 and 1930 alone, 2 million Black Southerners permanently leave the region. 2 million. The Great Migration arguably impacted the lives of almost 10 million Black Southerners. Scholars say that there's a push-pull thesis going on. In other words, Blacks are being pushed out of the South by racial oppression. I haven't even talked about sharecropping and the economic limitations, right? That's another lecture altogether. But the lack of economic opportunity, the prevalence of lynching and Jim Crow laws push African Americans from the South. At the same time, the places where Black Americans are going are pulling them because of economic opportunities. Places like Chicago and New York, Philadelphia, Detroit. Now, one of the things that I want to point out about this photograph, again, these primary sources are so important, is there's so much we can learn about the Great Migration in America that makes it historically unique from any other migration in world history. Look at the variety of ages. These are entire family units that are leaving. That's unusual in the history of global migration. Oftentimes what you see is that when there are large patterns of migration, it's young men who are leaving. Because the idea is that young men are leaving to make money for economic reasons, because they anticipate returning to their home country at a higher elevated social status, right? We see it with almost all groups except the Irish, and that was a migration of survival, right? From the Italians, from the Western Europeans, from the Eastern Europeans. The idea is we'll come to the United States, we'll send money home, and eventually we'll return with higher status than we once had. We see it with the Chinese on the West Coast as well, right? This is different because these are family units from young children all the way to grandparents who left together with no intention of coming back. That's the impact nationally on the social and economic conditions of the South. Look, I said between 1917 and 1930, approximately 2 million Black Southerners permanently left the region. 2 million was 50% of the 1880 Black population in the South. It's absolutely mind-blowing. The numbers don't lie. I don't like giving out too much information because sometimes we can get bogged down in the details to the point that we miss the big picture importance. But we know that between 1910 and 1920, 10 years, the Black population of Chicago increased 148%. The same decade, the Black population in Cleveland increased 307%. Detroit, between 1910 and 1920, the Black population increased 611%. In 1930, there are more native-born Mississippians living in Chicago than in Mississippi's 3 largest cities combined. That's the impact of the Great Migration. They're being pushed from the South because of the discriminatory laws, the lack of economic opportunity, and the racial violence. And they're being pulled by industry, by jobs, by the Ford company, by shipbuilding, by the railroad industry, right? By World War I. Now, this is going to cause a plethora of problems when white veterans return and find that African Americans have, quote unquote, taken their jobs. But one of the things where we also see African Americans beginning to resist, and this is a topic that resonates a lot with students, right? Anytime we can bring World War I and World War II and show that it's more than just about the conflict there. I don't know why, but this seems to click. Maybe it's a topic that they're more familiar with, right? But World War I, and as I'm going to talk about in a minute, World War II, are extremely important in terms of how we frame the Black freedom struggle, the civil rights movement of the 1960s, right? Because again, this is bigger than a person, a state, or a campaign. This is a national freedom struggle that stretches into and beyond the 1800s. Well, World War I, what role does World War I play in this coming Black freedom struggle? Well, I'm glad you asked. One of the things that happens is that the Black press, organizations, relatively young organizations like the NAACP, Black intellectuals like W.B. Du Bois, great stuff for primary source assignments, by the way. But they look at World War I as a great opportunity. They looked at World War I as a chance for Blacks who are now beginning to rebel against the South in large numbers by leaving it. The NAACP is beginning to push for a federal anti-lynching law. Black leaders say in 1917, when the United States declares war on the Central Powers, that it's our chance. It's our chance to prove that we deserve the equal citizenship rights that have been withheld from us. So people like Du Bois, the NAACP, they urge Black men to join the military with the expectation that if we fight for the country in a war to make the world safe for democracy, remember, that's Woodrow Wilson's phrase, 14 points, make the world safe for democracy, creation of a League of Nations that would end war as we know it, that if Black men can play a role in this war, we cannot be deprived our democratic rights at home. So Black men did respond to the call. Approximately 450,000 Black men joined the United States Armed Forces, almost 500,000. That was 20% of our fighting forces during the World War I period. You know, sometimes one of the great things about teaching history, and I think one of the great things about teaching social studies, is that sometimes you can get students invested by telling stories, right? The microcosm, this group represents something much bigger. And in World War I, the group that represents this promise demanded the right to fight. They were the Harlem 369th, who earned the nickname from their German enemies, the Hellfighters. Now, the Harlem 369th was actually a regiment of musicians. And their job under the USAF was to entertain white troops who were fighting in Western Europe. Well, long story short, the 369th demanded the right to fight. They didn't want to be there for entertainment purposes. And of course, there's a lot of racism here, that Black people can't fight, that they're cowardly, that they'll run, that they can't be organized. All of the negative stereotypes that white officers had permeated the way that the 369th were treated, regardless. The interesting thing about the 369th is that they demanded the right to combat, the right to fight for their country so much that the French said, we want you to fight for us. The only reason that the Hellfighters got the chance to have military combat experience is because the United States turned its back on them. They did not fight under the American flag. Their commanders wouldn't allow it. They fought instead under the French flag. And as a result, their accolades are unbelievable. Just some of the ones that I wrote down. They served the longest continuous stretch of combat of any American regiment during World War I, 191 straight days. 191 straight days of combat. The first American battalions, the first American regiment to see battlefield action, and the longest serving to see battlefield action. They never lost a person to capture. They never surrendered a foot in lost territory. The French gave their Croix de Guerre, which is like the American Medal of Freedom, 171 men received France's highest military honor. Henry Johnson, who not that long ago finally received the Congressional Medal of Honor, killed 28 Germans, shot 16 times. What it demonstrates, the importance here, is that African Americans demonstrated once again in combat the negative stereotypes that their own countrymen had against them were erroneous and false, which I guess is the same thing, but they were definitely erroneous. Many African Americans, because of the way that they were treated by the French, stay in France. They don't return to the United States. But for those who return, they were treated as heroes by the Black community. Over 1 million residents of New York City came to their victory parade in Harlem in 1919. But another thing that we have here is a great story. And W.B. Du Bois, upon their arrival, said, we return fighting. We return from fighting, we return fighting. We save democracy abroad, and by God, we'll save it in the United States. It shouldn't be a surprise that for every step forward we make as a country in terms of racial progress, there is an inevitable backlash. And the backlash was the Red Summer of 1919 that was one of the most racially divisive on record. 5 major American cities, most of them outside of the South. I think all but one was outside of the South. 5 US cities had major race riots, 90 lynchings in 1919. In the South, 10 African Americans were lynched while wearing their uniforms. So every time that there is progress, there's resistance. This is going to establish a foundation for this coming civil rights movement. We fought to save democracy in World War I, and the result was a racist backlash, including the largest race riot in American history up until the 1965 Watch Rebellion, and that was Chicago, 1919 Chicago, the deadliest race riot in American history up to 1966, right? All of it is because African Americans demanded the right to fight, served bravely, and were honored for it. Now, World War II is another place where we really see the foundation for the coming movement laid. And now, it's really, y'all can relate as teachers. The debate on what do you include and what do you leave out is never ending. The reason that I wanted to bookend kind of World War I and World War II is because if World War I, the Great War, was a war to make the world safe for democracy, it didn't quite seem like that for Black Americans, then the Good War is a war against fascism abroad. Because of the resistance, that American World War I veterans, Black American World War I veterans encountered after the First World War. Going into the Second World War and during, the Black press emphasized what they called the Double V campaign. Black soldiers emphasized what they called the Double V campaign. And what you can see here is that it was a double victory at home and abroad. During the war itself, not after, but during the war itself, Black American soldiers made it a priority to defeat, well, as they often said, Hitler in Europe, in Jim Crow in Alabama. We see over 1 million African Americans. A greater percentage of our army was made up of Black soldiers in World War II than even in World War I, even though they don't get combat roles until 1943. Now, here is the opportunity for you to introduce your students to where the leaders of the civil rights movement come from. They're veterans. Jackie Robinson was a veteran. Medgar Evers, a veteran. A. Philip Randolph, labor organizer. He's mobilizing for better accommodations for workers in federal industries during World War II. And I mean, you can just check off the list. A lot of the people, a lot of the men and women who became the earliest leaders of the civil rights campaigns of the 1950s were veterans of the Second World War. They were the living embodiment of the Double V campaign. We are going to defeat totalitarianism and fascism abroad, and then we're going to fight it and win at home. There is no shortage of examples that you can use, and this is actually the cartoon of the Double V. It was published in many Black newspapers during the Second World War to keep the community, to keep Americans aware of the fight does not end in Europe. We are going to continue it here. But there's no shortage of stories that you can use to engage students here. From Dory Miller, the hero of Pearl Harbor from the United States, an African-American messman, because in the Navy, African-Americans were not trained as fighters. They were only cooks or did menial labor. From Dory Miller at Pearl Harbor to the Tuskegee Airmen, right? Shot down 112 enemy planes, 179 successful bombing escorts without losing a single one. And it was an experiment that was set up to fail. Tuskegee Airmen's a great story. The story of the 761st Tank Battalion, the Red Ball Express, primarily Black soldiers who equipped our army as we moved into Germany. They were the backbone of our military's campaign against the Nazis as Germany collapsed. By the way, the 761st was also the first American tank battalion to liberate a concentration camp. And almost to a person, they equated what they saw in Europe with what they feared would become of them at home. That has an impact. That's powerful. That mobilizes a generation. Jim Crow, lynching, resistance, the Great Migration, the opportunities of World War I, frustrated, become the groundwork for World War II in a movement against segregation that's going to escalate as soon as the Second World War ends. So I'll treat you guys like I treat my lectures and my students. And that is, at the end of every topic, I have sort of a wrap up, and I put on there importance. What is the importance of this topic that we just explored? Number one, I know it's a theme that I've hit on a couple of times, but I think We can't say it enough. As long as there has been oppression in American history, there has been constant resistance to that oppression. Resistance and rebellion are two different things. Defiance has a long, long history in this country. If we don't stress how Black Americans resist, we deny them their humanity that we all have. Okay, so that's, I think, really important. Second thing about the topic of the long civil rights movement is that the movement isn't born in a vacuum. It's not the creation of a person or a group, but it's the culmination of many years of having a group denied their humanity. And finally, the movement of the 1960s first targets the existence of these discriminatory laws. So if we can't understand Jim Crow and what it creates and the context, the cultural context in which it's born, we don't understand what the movement is confronting. Is it just the right to eat a hamburger and drink a Coke at an integrated counter? No, it's much bigger than that. It's a movement for human dignity in this country. And that's the cliffhanger that I'll leave you with. How then do they obtain it? Well, you'll never know unless you come back Wednesday, right, Dave?
True story.
I think, Dave, this is a session for MCSS. I'll take questions. Or whatever is apropos for it. Look, first and foremost, I appreciate y'all coming out and listen to another historian at the end of the semester when all of y'all are, the last thing you want is another history lesson. The last thing you want, unless you're trying to avoid grading, which I can relate, so if you were trying to avoid grading, I get it. I'm with you. It's kind of like the Spider-Man meme. We're pointing at each other. But if you came of your own volition and grades are already in, then hey, you get the gold star of the day. But I'll take questions or anything that you feel is appropriate, Dave, and hopefully I'll see y'all back on Wednesday, if not before. The update on critical race theory. Are we safe to teach this? Yes, Katie. And the reason that I say that is because we're not teaching theory. We are teaching fact. Primary source-based, chronological, evidence-based history. Critical race theory is not this. Critical race theory, as we know, is not taught at K through 12. Critical race theory is only taught in the most advanced law school classes in this country. What critical race theory is, and what critical race theory has been defined as, well, one of the leading theories of critical race theory, one of the leading practitioners of critical race theory, or writers of it, has called the war over critical race theory one of definitional theft. This is not critical race theory. This is history. And the fact that it makes some people uncomfortable, number one, shows that history is doing its job. This is not supposed to make us feel comfortable. This is supposed to make us understand how this country has not always lived up to the promise that it has made to all citizens equally. And it's a story of how citizens like all of us have expected and demanded and received better from their nation. And that doesn't mean that the struggle stops. But that's part 3 of the seminar series. So yeah, Katie, she gave me a chance to put my high horse on top of my soapbox. So I kind of climbed on top of it there. But yes, thank you for that. Is this critical race theory? No. So you don't have to worry about someone saying that you're indoctrinating. And oh, by the way, Dave, if anybody in this chat can indoctrinate students, please let me know. I can't get mine to do the reading. So, if y'all got the magic potion, please indoctrinate away.
Well, then Katie might be referring to, we've got Senate Bill 460 in the Michigan legislature. It's still in the Education Committee. Who knows if it'll, come out of there. I'm fairly confident that if it comes out and is voted on, it'll be vetoed by our governor. We're really able to see checks and balances in action, having a governor of one political party and a legislature of another political party right now, and about a 50-50 Supreme Court. So it's really an interesting time to be alive. But I think that, I think exactly what you just said. If we're teaching the story, if we're teaching through the primary sources, if we're actually, you can't, I'm just going to stop there. You said it much better than I can.
No, and the thing that I've seen, Dave, is one of the things that politicians, especially in Florida, do not like are scholars, teachers, and people who are much smarter than them pushing back. Because DeSantis was asked about the cancellation of this seminar in Osceola County, and his response was, "Oh, that's not what critical race theory is about," and he walked off. Right? So for people to say, this is not what critical race theory is, that's not something that politicians can handle because they're not educators. And quite frankly, most of them aren't very smart. So being able to dismantle what they claim it is from what historical truth is not something that they're equipped to deal with. But maybe we can talk about that in the third episode when we talk about what made this topic so controversial, right? What made it raise red flags, ironically enough, about the teaching of critical race theory. So anyway.
Well, Dr. Butler, I really appreciate your time with us tonight. I've been running the online learning committee since it started about 3 years ago. And like a total newbie, I completely forgot to hit the record button until about 10 minutes in. So I'm gonna get with you offline about the possibility of maybe on Wednesday meeting a few minutes early to re-record your Plessy slide, and then I've got the video editing chops to splice it all together like I never made the mistake to begin with. So stay tuned, we'll talk about that. So anyone looking for the recap, it's not going to be my normal 24-hour turnaround time. And episode 2 will be up on Thursday is what I'm going to say. But we greatly appreciate your time, and I'm super happy we could make this work, and I can't wait till Wednesday.
Oh no, that y'all made it even more challenging. How am I going to take the civil rights movement and boil it down to an hour? Whew. Good luck, right? But no, this was I really love doing this. I appreciate y'all's attentiveness, and the compliments and the thanks are great. So I'm looking forward to being back on Wednesday.
Awesome. Well, everyone else, if you are taking this for sketches, we will send out the sketch form alongside the announcement that things have posted in the member portal on the website. So stay tuned for that a little bit later in the week. But on behalf of the entire Michigan Council for Social Studies, we want to thank Dr. Butler and all of you for being here tonight, and we will see you on Wednesday.
Thank you. See y'all then.